Delighted to have you with us today, and we look forward to celebrating your progress as the day continues. Without further ado, I would like to introduce the chairs for today's opening and introductions. We have with us Professor Marie-Claire Cordonnier-Segal, who is Leverhulme Trust Visiting Professor at the University of Cambridge, Executive Secretary of the Climate Law and Governance Initiative, as well as Senior Director for the Center for International Sustainable Development Law. Alongside her, we have Dr. Ahmed F. Khalifa, who is the Director of International Relations and Collaborations at Ain Shams University in Cairo, our local co-host partners for this year. Without further ado, Professor and Dr. Khalifa, please, it's over to you.
Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. It is wonderful to see so many of you joining us online for this very special COP27 Climate Law and Governance Specialization course. As you know, every year, the partners of the Climate Law and Governance Initiative come together in order to provide additional training, capacity strengthening, and peer learning opportunities in the context of the COP27. Our purpose is not to give you a comprehensive, deep understanding of climate law and governance, but simply to offer you an opportunity to explore, discover, share ideas, meet each other, and build unusual collaborations. Every year in the participant evaluations, which are filled out by you and also by the heads of your delegations or observer institutions, you emphasize the need for interaction, for collaboration, for getting to know not just world-class instructors from all over the world, but also each other. And we structure the course in order to try to ensure to provide that to you. Climate change is the justice challenge of our century. And what we are doing here today is helping in the small way we can to equip as many as possible of our law and governance community with some of the tools to cope with it. I welcome you. I am honored and deeply, deeply delighted to see so many of you joining us online today, and I look forward to a fruitful course. I would now like to turn to Dr. Khalifa, who is, of course, the representative of our partner institution, Ain Shams University, to help us to open this day.
Good morning, everyone. We have the great pleasure as Ain Shams University to co-host alongside our partner with the Center of International Sustainable Development Law, Cambridge University, and other partners, the Climate Law and Governance Day and the Climate Law and Governance Specialization course. I have to say that I'm really happy as an academic to see this course specifically as one of our activities alongside the COP for two reasons. First is that in the region, in the Middle East and in Egypt specifically, we do lack courses that are open for professionals and young scholars on climate law and climate change challenge. So this course that hopefully will always be on the agenda of the practitioners and scholars of the Arab world will always fill this gap. But the second reason for which I'm happy to contribute as representing my university in co-hosting this course is for the technique that my colleagues are distinguishably going to run the course through, which is actually an interactive technique where you listen from a highly expert in the domain, but also you work through your way alongside this half day through problems, and you put your knowledge in challenge with your other colleagues in the course to come up with as close as possible solutions to the problem that we are facing all, which is the climate change law. Without any undue delay, I wish all of you a fruitful course, and I'm sure that the collaboration will continue in this and other activities. Thank you all, and have a good course.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed Khalifa. It is an honor and a pleasure to have you collaborating this year in this process. And we've just shared, as many of you online know, a very interesting and engaging and substantively rich Climate Law and Governance Day. We are looking forward to sharing with you the videos from that day, all of those who registered in order to be able to have at least another 1,400 registrants across the region and across the world who are able to understand and hear about some of the most recent developments in climate law and governance. Now, I am deeply, deeply honored to turn to our principal partner in the specialization course for many years, together with many partners over the years, including, of course, the International Bar Association, the International Law Association, the International Development Law Organization, and indeed, actually, for several years, and I need to credit them especially for the development of the teaching materials, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat itself have been incredibly instrumental in making this course possible. But the main partner, the most important partner, the principal partner for us has always been the World Commission on Environmental Law. And we are very, very lucky to have the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law Deputy Chair here with us, who is, of course, also lead counsel for climate change for the Center for International State Involvement Law and has been since Marrakesh COP, where he hosted us all. So I'm going to turn to Maître Ayman Sharkawi and ask him if he could say a few words of welcome.
Thank you very much, Marie-Claire. On behalf of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law, we are very happy to engage with this course. We believe it is an important moment. It is a tradition in every COP to have that time set aside for our community to learn from one another and to raise the profile of incoming stars of our field so that they can further contribute to our domain. We are very happy to be here in Shams, of course, in this important COP. Egypt is doing tremendous work in terms of hosting us. Thank you very much for hosting us in this beautiful city. You cannot see because the camera is pointing this way, but you have a beautiful view of Sharm el-Sheikh that is absolutely magnificent. The IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law is committed to capacity building. We have an early career specialist group, which is chaired by Marina and Alvin. You're welcome to send an email to wcl@iucn.org if you'd like to know more. Just a few days ago, the UNFCCC asked me to be the capacity building expert of the technical dialogue of the GST. And in my remark, the meeting was actually taking place a few kilometers from here in the Blue Zone in a room called Memphis. In my remark, I said that the ancient city of Memphis is known, among other things, for a god called Ptah. And this particular god was the protector of architects and craftsmen. So in the context of this particular course, I hope that by the end of it, you have become beautiful, knowledgeable, even better at being craftsmen of climate change law and governance. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much as well, Ayman. We are joined here online by two others who I would like to invite to say just a few sentences of welcome. I will first turn to our always partner for many, many years, but recently here in the implementation COP, the COP27, truly stepping forward to ensure that practitioners can access climate law and governance and can become active in this area. I would like to introduce Dr. Lara, who is here with us online, and she is, of course, a representative of the International Bar Association. We hosted a very successful event in the Blue Zone of the COP27 yesterday, hosted by them and several leading bar associations, and we would love to have her just say a few words of welcome on behalf of her community. I'll give Lara a second or two to get online and to be able to say a few words of welcome. And while we do that, I will also turn to Dr. Marcus Gehring, the course convener, who this year, together with a tireless team, which we would like to recognize and thank, including Tejas Rao and Antoinette Nestor and Maeve McDermott, has been able to bring together the course this year. Dr. Marcus Gehring, would you be able to say a few words of welcome on behalf of the University of Cambridge?
Absolutely, Marie-Claire. Thank you very much for those who are joining us today. It's a wonderful opportunity to share and learn together here on the side of COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. Egypt is particularly welcome to team up with the local university in Cairo and all our partners online. I know many of our participants are also from the MENA region, and I warmly welcome those participants. We have a packed course for you with a lot of participatory elements. So I hope you will enjoy this specialization course, which is so important because I think the legal community needs to specialize in climate law, because sooner or later we will all be faced with questions on climate change relevant to all legal practices. So a warm welcome from me. Marie-Claire, did you want me to run through the program quickly as well?
Dave, can you make it more? Oh, it's down there. All right. Yes, we're just arranging things here, but I would be very happy again if the technical folk could unmute Advocate Lara Duvart-Sidis. She is waiting online to speak. She just needs to be unmuted. So if you can unmute her, then we will be able to see her, and she'll be able to give a couple of words of greeting. Lara, are you now unmuted?
Yes, I believe so.
Wonderful. Would you like to greet us quickly?
I would. Thank you, everyone, and hello to every participant who's joining from all over the world. My name is Lara. As Marie-Claire said, I'm from the International Bar Association. I'm a project lawyer there. However, I did spend 3 or 4 years practicing law as an environment and planning lawyer in Sydney beforehand. I just want to take the opportunity to say that I am a younger lawyer myself. I'm only 29, and I would urge every person on this call, every future practitioner, to really embrace this call and do the most you can to engage with the subject materials, because it's on all of us to become climate literate, which will help us with our professional duties and particularly in practice moving forward, because we all need to learn this. And I just want to say, reach out to me if you have any questions about how to engage more, as someone that has just recently gone through the first 5 years of practice myself. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, and warmest of welcomes. I'm just going to check one last time. Is Dr. Omar online? Noting that he may not be, I will immediately pass back to Marcus as our convener for today, and if he could move us forward to the first session.
Claire, Dr. Omar is online, and I think he can welcome the participants quickly.
I'm not sure that he has been able to connect with audio. Please, if he can connect with audio, could he say a couple of words of welcome? And if not, please, Marcus, can you move us to the next section?
Yes, as I said, welcome everyone for the Climate Law and Governance Specialization course. I will briefly outline the program. We started already with openings and introductions. We'll have a very short presentation by Professor Marie-Claire Cordonier-Seger on the foundations, understanding the Paris Agreement under the UNFCCC. We will then go straight into the first substantive session on law, governance, and climate mitigation, which is instructed and animated by Professor Michael Mailing from MIT and myself. The second session will then cover adaptation, loss and damage, and that is animated by Hafiz Khan and Metra Ayman Chakawi. And the last session will cover climate law and governance on finance, compliance, and transparency. The instructor will be Wendy Miles, KC, and Michael Mailing will also be available. And then we will have a very short closing ceremony and announcements for awarding certificates to participants. That then concludes our climate law and governance course. It's very important, Marie-Claire, if you could perhaps, if we could go back to you, that you explain the participatory elements.
Thank you very much. And I'm very, very pleased and honored to announce that Dr. Omar has now joined us online. He is available, and we are very, very pleased to have him with us. So if you could say just 2 sentences of welcome, and then he is also going to help us with a longer intervention in the closing when all of you have earned your certificates. So Dr. Omar, please, the floor is yours. You may need to unmute him. Yeah, perfect. You may need to give him the unmute. Yeah.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for next time. I want to talk about the teaching environmental and climate change law, sustainable development in the region, the MENA. I think it is one of the most important things to talk about, especially when we talk about the governance for the environmental and climate change, which is now is the most important subject in the area. First of all, we have about more than 500 universities in Arab states here, or and more than 1,000 universities in the MENA. We have a different system of different legal system in the area, or something which is related to Anglo-Saxon, and the other is related to Latin system. The other is related to Islamic law. We have also many of the development provisions of law. At the same time, we have climate change types in the area, which means that we have the desert, we have the seas area, we have the mountains, we have the Dead Sea in Jordan, we have Sharm el-Sheikh and Aqaba in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, Aqaba in Jordan, which have an in biodiversity type. That means we have different type of provisions of law which is treated with environmental law, climate change, and biodiversity, with also with the climate change. All these types also was related or cooperative with international conventions. When we talk about the seas, that means the international convention or agreement for seas and oceans. We have also the many agreements about the treatments. We have many agreements about the natures. We have many agreements about nuclear. We have many agreements, international agreements about every type of the for every type of environmental law in the world. And there is another provisions of law in interior for every country, which is related to this convention, or which is by applied for this convention or not applied until now. That means we must have an
Dr. Omar, sorry to interrupt. This is Marcus Gehring. We only have a little bit of time. If you could summarize your thoughts in just one sentence, please.
One sentence, okay. We want a great effort to teach environmental climate change law, and we need for more also efforts to teach the governance for the climate change, which is one of the important thing in our area that we are in need in future.
Thank you so much, Omar, for these inspiring words. And as one of the leading practitioners in Jordan and in the entire MENA regions, we are particularly happy that you're part of this specialization course. Marie-Claire, you have the floor back.
Thank you very, very much. I know we're all working to be able to use the online technology that is very, very difficult, but I really appreciate that everyone has joined us, that everyone is showing a bit of patience. And Dr. Omar, I especially appreciate your words, and I look forward to hearing more from you in the closing ceremony, where we will have a little more time. So thank you very, very much for your engagement and for your assistance. This has been crucial. And I should mention that the Al-Khataibe Center for International Arbitration and Training is a main partner in this event. And I think it is very important to recognize and thank Jordan and the Al-Khataibe Center for the work that you're doing. It has been very, very much appreciated. So just quickly then, I understand, and if someone can move the camera properly so that the camera is on the instructors or on the gallery view, that would be wonderful. Then I think we can go ahead with this last 6 minutes of teaching before this entire session closes. And I can at least give this terrace back to the individuals who want to sit here and can't sit anywhere else in the facility. So I think if Marcus can show the slides, I will briefly introduce the Paris Agreement and then move you to the main aspect of this international course, the most important aspect, which is of course the aspect of interaction among the participants. Marcus, do we have the slides, or Tejas or the others online? If we have the slides, that would be super. Maybe you can screen share the slides. I'll ask Maeve if she can help. Ah, Marcus is screen sharing them. Wonderful. It's probably just there's a little time delay, and as long as we're patient with it, we'll be fine. So this particular segment is on the foundations, understanding the UNFCCC Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. I'm going to do my best to give you an understanding of key elements, structures, and principles of the Paris Agreement, an understanding of the key challenges and opportunities in the implementation of the UN climate change regime, and an opportunity to gain insights on the key role of law and regulation in the transition toward low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. Next slide, please. Just briefly, climate change is a common concern of mankind. And some of the World Meteorological Organization's actual estimates and scenarios that have been developed are showing us that the impacts of climate change cannot be underestimated. Over 35 million people affected by floods, over 1,600 deaths associated with wildfires and heat waves, 883,000 internal displacements, 821 million undernourished partly due to drought, and many other impacts are what already face us today. Next slide, please. So to address that, the world has come together with the Paris Agreement. Its objectives are setting a long-term temperature goal of 2 degrees and striving to keep warming below 1.5 degrees, as well as resilience, adaptation, and low greenhouse gas emissions, sustainable development. This is for collective efforts. The global emissions trajectory needs to peak, reduce, and balance, with sources and sinks contributing by the second half of the 21st century. And the individual efforts of each country toward the global response to climate change through nationally determined contributions will be key. You will look at all of this in your 3 interactive segments. Next slide, please. I'm not going to walk you through the entire regime, but simply point out that Article 2 gives us the purpose: mitigation, adaptation, financial flows, change. Article 3 looks at how the parties can achieve this through their nationally determined contributions, which, while they are set at a certain level in the beginning, over time they ratchet up, they progress, they become progressively more ambitious. The mitigation commitments, the adaptation commitments, the finance commitments in Articles 4, 6, 7, 9, and also Article 10, 11, and 13 on technology, capacity building, and transparency are extremely key in order to be able to participate in the climate change regime. And backstopping and supporting all of them is the Implementation and Compliance Committee that has been established, on which many of our colleagues are serving. the lawyers of the group. Finally, by doing a global stocktake every 5 years towards the purpose and long-term goals of the Paris Agreement, taking a look at sinks covered in Article 5, other mechanisms in Article 6, the delicate balanced agreement in Article 8 on loss and damage, and the great importance of public awareness and education in Article 12, this is the structure of the Paris Agreement. The way I'd like to describe it is as a triangle with 3 points. Action, climate action for the global response to climate change on mitigation, adaptation, and resilience, backed by finance at adequate levels, new additional finance. We were promised 100 billion a year by 2020 and more is needed, and supported by and guaranteed by transparency, monitoring, reporting, verification, and all of the other support mechanisms. Next slide, please. In your 3 substantive sessions, you will take a careful look at all of these. So I will just go through it now in very, very brief overview. We have guidance and accounting rules for the nationally determined contributions. We have some important areas to discuss response measures. We have a global stocktake, and we are preparing information to be able to undertake that stocktake. We also have climate finance, and we know, of course, that climate finance will be needed at much larger levels than initially projected, partly because the impacts are already being felt today and more is needed to turn the global economy in the correct direction. The enhanced transparency framework brings these together, and they facilitate the implementation and compliance with the treaty. Like the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer, to the Vienna Protocol on the ozone layer in general, we have seen that the facilitative mechanism for compliance is something that can be done through this committee approach, and we are going to do our very best to implement it in the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. Last but not least, as I mentioned earlier, in the adoption of the Paris Rulebook, one of the things that became very clear, and the climate summits and the attempts of the presidencies of each COP to move forward and to advance and to encourage countries to become progressively more ambitious, we can see that the ambition mechanism in the Paris Agreement itself is predicated on a ratcheting up of commitments year by year and every 5 years. And by 2050, these net zero emissions and climate resilience must be fully in place. So at each point along the trajectory, there's an attempt to communicate new or updated NDCs and to make new pledges. And this will be, again, the subject of your colleagues' interventions in the upcoming time. Next slide, please. I think rather than trying to walk you through this detailed description of the regime, I am going to let our colleagues go into the detail that is needed and simply underscore and conclude by the general point that law and regulation can play a key role in the transition toward greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. There need to be changes at the individual level, yes, but at the institutional level and the systemic level, all of these changes must come together. The Paris Agreement provides us with an international framework. The action is still ours. And as low
Sorry, Marie-Claire, you might need to repeat that briefly. You were cut out for there for a second.
Yeah.
Can no longer hear you, Marie-Claire. So I will just highlight that law and regulation can play a key role in the transition towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. And that happens at 3 levels: individual level, institutional level, and systemic level. They all interact with each other, so we need changing attitudes. We need focusing on organizational performance and capabilities. And at the systemic level, we need to address the overall framework within which institutions and individuals operate and interact, creating an enabling environment through economic and regulatory policies towards the impact, and to, in particular, to effectively address the challenges of climate change and in achieving sustainability with
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you for stepping in. I really appreciate it. I was actually asking if you could switch to the last slide, because I would like to conclude with an invitation. And the invitation is to all of those who are joining us. No, the second to last slide. The invitation is to all of those who are joining us, if they can consider adding climate law and governance to your practice, either as students or as practicing lawyers or as governance specialists. And if you decide to do so, you can register in Glasgow. Over 200 partners came together during Climate Law and Governance Day. And we took on the pledge to try our very best by 2024 to raise the number of trained specialists in this area from 600 worldwide to 6,000 worldwide. It's a stretch pledge, but we also need stretch pledges from our governments, and we can do no less ourselves. So please join us by registering as a climate law and governance specialist after this course. We will provide you with the information on how to do so. It's an online website that you can register. Already, just by Googling climate law and governance registry, you would be able to fall upon the site. And if you are going to add climate law and governance to your studies as a student or to your practice as a lawyer, you are welcome to join us in this community. With that, I would like to thank everyone for their patience with the internet connection challenges that we have faced here. And I would like to especially thank Marcus, who is walking us through the course, and turn over to your instructors for your first substantive session. Thank you very, very much.
Marie-Claire, I just put the slide with the Climate Pledge Registry on the screen, if you want to just say one more thing about it.
Wonderful. And I think the most important thing to underscore here is that you can join us now, as long as you are making the commitment to include climate law and governance practice or climate law and governance studies in your work as a lawyer or as a governance specialist. So you are very, very welcome to join the registry as you conclude this course today, and also to invite others who may have been trained through other ways to be able to join us as well. By 2024, we need to be 6,000 strong. We're getting there. We very much hope that you can join. And I want to thank Heather Rosemarin, who's one of our learners, who has already added the link to the registry into the chat for this session. So as Senior Director of the CISDL and as Executive Secretary to the Climate Law and Governance Initiative as a partnership that has come out of the COP and supports the implementation of the Paris Agreement, I would like to wish you an extremely good course and thank everyone, especially Dr. Marcus Gehring of the University of Cambridge and Professor Michael Mailing of the MIT and Strathclyde, and Maître Ayman Sherkawi of the World Commission for Environmental Law, and Mr. Hafiz Khan of the Center for Climate Justice in Bangladesh, as well as, of course, Wendy Miles QC of the Net Zero Lawyers Alliance for the teaching that they're going to do today. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marie-Claire, and it's a great pleasure to start this second session. We will move straight into the discussion on law, governance, and climate mitigation. My name is Marcus Gehring. I'm a fellow of the Loudport Center in the University of Cambridge, where I teach international and European Union environment and sustainable development law. And my co-instructor is Professor Michael Mailing from the University Strathclyde and MIT in the United States. Michael will start us off. Michael, you have the floor.
Thank you, Marcus. I have noted to you, I think in the chat just now, that my hotel has decided it is now the time to start the disco. I hope the background noise is not too bad. And let's kick off with the first slide. Just to join and add to everything that's been said so far, climate is becoming mainstream in the legal practice, in the legal profession. There's no area of law really where you can avoid dealing with climate, and that underscores the importance of this course. So I'm really pleased to be participating. I think it's the 5th year now in this course. For this first segment on mitigation, one of the pillars, of course, of the climate regime, our learning objectives are to hear about what mitigation actually means. It's a very broad term in the climate regime, and also how it is achieved in national law, in subnational law, and so forth, to gain some insight into the tools that governments have at their disposal, but not only governments, also cities, also states and provinces, also the private sector. Under the Paris Agreement, the Katowice and subsequent decisions by parties, and then, of course, the operationalization in domestic law, and then build understanding of the participants here in this course of the scope and the nature and the outcomes of market and non-market mitigation measures, which is one of the few sort of actual tools enshrined in the Paris Agreement. A lot of the rest sort of mitigation happens at the domestic level and is left to the discretion of parties. Let's go to the next slide, please. So, as I said, mitigation is a broad concept. You find probably the most important provision in Article 4 of the Paris Agreement, but despite it being sort of a bit vague and broad, and I'll come up with a definition in a moment, it is one of the central pillars of the climate regime. This is essentially the pillar that helps us get to the long-term temperature goals that Marie-Claire just mentioned, that are enshrined in Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, but can also be found in other previous treaties, the Kyoto Protocol, and of course, the convention itself, which has sort of its long-term temperature stabilization objectives. So mitigation is how we get to that goal, how we get to achieve that target. But there is no specific or one sort of definition in the Paris Agreement itself or in the convention. Instead, we have sort of broader, if you like, conceptualizations. UN Environment, so what's used to be known as the UN Environment Program, now UN Environment, defines it as follows: using new technologies and renewable energies to replace older equipment with more energy efficient, more sustainable approaches, changing management practices or consumer behavior. So all those dimensions that we saw in the previous slide on the sort of dimensions of climate change. And you know, it can take many different shapes depending on the context. It could be a new plan for more sustainable urban development. It could be a cook stove design. Of course, some of the big sort of things that we see happening on the ground is decarbonizing the power sector by replacing fossil fuel generation of electricity with renewables, for instance, electrifying transportation and so on. So again, it's sector specific what actually happens to make mitigation, but all of these things sort of together help us get to these long-term temperature goals. And for parties to the Paris Agreement, the main sort of vehicle to signal how they're going to do it are the nationally determined contributions set out in or defined in Article 3 and also specified more in Article 4, with guidance having come since in the COPs in Katowice, in Glasgow, and still being discussed, you know, how to do things like the formats, the terminology, the concepts that are used in nationally determined contributions. And this is a cyclical process. So states had to submit or were invited to submit an NDC in 2020, and every 5 years subsequently, they're supposed to submit a new nationally determined contribution, which has to be a progression relative to the previous NDC. That is sort of the ambition mechanism in there. And these have to address many different things. So the guidance coming from the parties has discussed things as co-benefits, capacity building support for developing countries. Article 4 also mentions, for instance, finance, but we'll have a separate session on that. A common time frame for communicating NDCs, how to deal with negative impacts of response measures, such as, say, carbon pricing and other tools on certain countries and sectors that will have negative spillover effects of mitigation in other countries, and so on. Let's briefly look at the next slide, where we can see sort of how this is a economy-wide, if you like, effort. It is something that happens top-down and bottom-up. Every country, every party to the Paris Agreement, in addition, of course, to submitting an NDC where they sort of communicate their best effort, their best, to the best of their ability and their national circumstances, what they will do on mitigation, then proceeds to how to implement this, how to achieve this domestically. And again, this goes across all sectors, planning for the energy sector, for transport sector, waste, industry, agriculture, forestry, and so on and so forth. And in each of these regulations, laws, and other tools to implement these targets, to implement these goals are adopted. That is, of course, also where the legal perspective comes in, the operationalization, if you like, where it actually then becomes binding, where actually the details, the processes, the institutional structures are set up, is in laws and regulations across all these sectors. And some things, of course, can be cross-cutting, such as national climate legislation, a national framework climate law that can kind of create an umbrella under which all these sectoral efforts occur. And again, finance, technology, cooperation, capacity building, they all are essential for mitigation, especially in the context between developed and developing countries. So you cannot really separate them. We're focusing on mitigation here, and we will have a separate session talking, for instance, on finance later. But again, they're all interwoven and interdependent. I mentioned earlier that the Paris Agreement itself does not define many specific mitigation tools. This is mostly left to the discretion of countries, as shown here with this chart on the left. You know how it happens, the planning and implementation domestically. That is the fundamental, if you like, approach or spirit of the Paris Agreement, that it does not prescribe how countries will achieve their NDCs. But there is one provision in the Paris Agreement, Article 6, that does set out mechanisms. And if we can move to the next slide, Marcus, should I continue describing Article 6, or should we hand over here and you wrap up with the Article 6 mechanisms? What would you prefer? Well, I'll continue. Then I see, great, the slide has come up. So Article 6, some wrongly call it the markets provision. Actually, it is not the markets provision per se. It doesn't even mention the word markets if you look closely, but it sets out 3 cooperative mechanisms that allow parties to work together to further the goals of the Paris Agreement, including, of course, mitigation towards the long-term temperature goals and stabilizing greenhouse gas emissions concentrations in the atmosphere. 2 of these can be interpreted as a way to implement markets. Previous iterations of the Kyoto Protocol, a treaty that was in place before the Paris Agreement succeeded it, did have very specific market mechanisms. In the Paris Agreement, we've avoided that term. We've avoided zeroing in and sort of narrowing it to market mechanisms. But again, 2 mechanisms, Article 6.2 and Article 6.4, do allow parties to the Paris Agreement to engage in transfers, engage in transactions, you could say, in which one party has activities in its territory that reduce emissions, and another party can then take credit for those reductions. And typically there would be some exchange, say, of investment of funds. So really this does look very much and ultimately can be used to operationalize things such as emissions trading between countries that are parties to the Paris Agreement. But there is no hierarchy, and it's important to also mention that there is a provision at the end of Article 6, Article 6, paragraph 8, which also talks about cooperation between parties using non-market approaches. So cooperating in various different ways, it's still relatively open. We don't have much experience. We don't have much empirical evidence yet or observational data how parties will use all 3 of these provisions. We're still operationalizing and getting started. There has been some activity, especially on Article 6, paragraph 2, between parties to set up sort of pilot agreements. Switzerland and Peru, for instance, are cooperating on what will eventually probably be an Article 6.2 transfer. The parties are in this COP negotiating some of the details of Article 6.4, and there will also be more guidance. There has been in Glasgow, but it's still very vague, but there will also be more guidance and eventually state experience, state practice on Article 6.8. In the next slide, I think we have sort of a look and breakdown of the different elements of implementing. So in the agreement itself, as I mentioned, Article 6, paragraph 1, which sort of creates the umbrella, but 6, paragraph 2, 6, paragraph 4, and then 6, paragraph 8, not to forget. And then we've had in Glasgow a breakthrough between parties to agree on guidance, rules, modalities, and procedures on these different mechanisms. I don't think it's very useful to go into too much more detail here because one can quickly get lost in very technical aspects, registries, infrastructure, accounting to avoid double counting. The operationalization for us lawyers, again, of these instruments to ensure that they're robust and that they contribute to the goals is absolutely essential. And it gets very technical very quickly. So again, I think we can skip looking at that in detail. Marcus, I think we're sort of running into our time. Whether or not we want to say something about domestic emissions trading systems, I would say probably.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Participants will get our additional slides where we have a short history of emission trading and the history of the clean development mechanism. All of this is more of historic interest, and we have already talked quite a bit about the history of mitigation, this sustainable development mechanism. So I would like to bring us into the online participants' questions. This is an interactive course, and we have about 25 minutes, actually 20 minutes from now, to discuss some of the general framework and the mitigation question in it worked, Tejas. And the mitigation questions in our small groups. So I will briefly explain how this is going to work. In just a few minutes, you will all the wonderful participants that we have, and I apologize, there were some technical issues, so you're all welcome now, will be put into smaller groups. And we'll ask you as a first task to select a rapporteur and a timekeeper, and then have a discussion. I should remind you that there are many lawyers on this specialization course, and lawyers love to talk. So please don't dominate the conversation. You will be in groups of 10, and you will have an opportunity to please share your views. There will be also mixed abilities. So some have a lot of experience in climate law, others don't. So please share your experience without dominating the conversation. And then we'll ask you to do two things. We'll ask you to list the top 3 priorities for law and governance relating to climate mitigation in at least 2 countries that your group selects, ideally from 2 regions of the world. And second, to list 3 key elements of domestic emission trading systems that are compatible with the Paris Agreement. The timekeeper gives warnings after 15 minutes, 5 minutes, and 0 minutes, and then the Zoom cuts off automatically. The rapporteurs will please type in bullet points the answers and email them to Nick and Juliette, our assistant instructors here on this course, who at the very end of the course will look at the interactive contributions that are being made. So we have now reached the full hour. I will ask the Zoom moderators to put all participants into groups. If English, like for me, is not your first language, you can either write some of the contributions into the chat, or have a friend or colleague translate your contribution from your native language. So we want to make this as interactive, as participatory as can. The 2 instructors for this session, Professor Mehling and myself, will go around the breakout rooms like we would as if we were in person, and answer any questions that you might have and give some additional guidance. So without further ado, I now ask the Zoom moderators to put us into breakout rooms for exactly 25 minutes.
We were checking into the different breakout rooms with the team, and it sounds like Professor Michael Mailing and Dr. Marcus Gehring did an amazing job of explaining a highly complex and technical area of law. And many of you are now already emailing from your rapporteur your comments to the 2 email addresses that you have posted. I will ask you to please make sure that you send that email as soon as you possibly can. Do not wait till the end of the day, because we are assessing your answers to the problems that you were set. And it's very important to us to know whether your answers show a clear understanding of the topic. We will be referring to them in the closing when we explain to you also how to complete your certification. So please definitely do ensure that your rapporteurs are super responsible people who send the report right away by email. It doesn't matter if it's not absolutely perfect grammatically. It doesn't matter if you manage to finish completely or not your arrangements or your questions. What we want to do is to get a sense of whether the material now makes sense to you and you've had a chance to talk internationally about some of the challenges. With that, I am very, very deeply honored and pleased to turn us over to the next session. And in particular, I think that the important aspects of the Paris Agreement that are to be learned need to be covered in a balanced manner. Now, I understand, Marcus, please correct me if I'm wrong, that we're just about to go into the second session, so we're running a little bit behind time. All right, well then, without further ado, I will quickly introduce first, in our world, now also a professor in this course, but Maître Ayman Cherkaoui, who has taught this section of the course for many years. And he is joining us, of course, having hosted the Marrakesh COP, which ushered into force the Paris Agreement after great efforts on behalf of the presidency and many other countries. And he is also, of course, not only the lead counsel for climate change for the Center for International Sustainable Development Law, but also the director of the Hassan II Center for Environmental Training. So we couldn't have a better qualified professor on this course. And his role in the World Commission on Environmental Law is something that I know he draws on with his access to world-class experts at all times. And he will be teaching climate law and governance on adaptation, loss, and damage. And he will do this, if at all possible, with participation of Maître Hafiz Khan. Hafiz is the director of the Center for Climate Justice in Bangladesh and also a chair of the Climate Law and Governance Initiative alongside Maître Ayman. He is, however, in the middle of the loss and damage negotiations because he's a specialist in this area who helped to negotiate the Paris Agreement in this area. And given this particular COP and the focus, he may or may not be able to join us online. Luckily, we are very, very grateful to Ayman for being willing to carry the course forward. Please, Maître Ayman.
Hello, can you hear me?
We hear you well.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Excellent. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Marie-Claire, for this lovely introduction. I'm very happy to be, again, in a position to engage in this important course on this topic that is dear to my heart. As you may have heard over the last few years, we are very much in a race against time when it comes to climate change. You may have heard about the race to zero, for example, the race to resilience. You may have heard that this race is both a marathon and a sprint. In the case of my presentation, it will very much be a sprint, as we have only a few minutes to cover an important topic and several slides. So apologies, as I'll be covering quite a bit of content in a short amount of time. Next slide, please. Yes, so in terms of these objectives, of course, will be one of the 3 objectives has to build your understanding of the legal and policy regime for adaptation and loss and damages, so that in groups you will also have opportunity to share these different elements of country and legal approaches, and then other, of course, elements of objectives. Next slide, please. Thank you. First things first, let's start with definition. As you may have heard quite a bit, the words adaptation and resilience being thrown around. When it comes to adaptation, first, one needs to understand that we're talking about human systems in the context of UNFCCC, and the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate and its effects in order to moderate harm or exploit beneficial opportunities. Those definitions are being taken from the IPCC 2018 1.5 report. Resilience, on the other hand, is the capacity of social, economic, and environmental system to cope with hazardous events or trend or disturbance. Next slide, please. So the adaptation process is very much an iterative process, which is why you can see in this slide this idea of cycle. First, it is about assessing the impacts, vulnerability, and risk. Then it is about planning for adaptation. Then it is about implementing adaptation measures. And then you monitor and evaluate adaptation. But it is not final, of course, because based on this monitoring and evaluation effort, you then enlighten the approach of assessment when it comes to the impact, vulnerability, and risks. Of course, those components of the different steps include engagement of a variety of stakeholders, because adaptation is very much an all hands on deck issue. Information is also very important, making sure that there's political capital, that is also the information, knowledge, and guidance, and capacity building, and making sure that the capacity building is both at the individual level and the institutional level is critical. Finally, in the UNFCCC space, we often put together FTC, finance, technology, and capacity as means of implementation. Of course, facilitation of these elements of FTC is critical to adaptation. Next slide, please. Regarding the adaptation landscape within UNFCCC, and this particular element is taken straight from the UNFCCC Secretariat. We have 5 different dimensions. First, science, research, systematic observation, then knowledge and assessment, planning and implementation, addressing residual risks, and support from institutions. Under each of them, you can see that there are different programs and components that are indicated. Each of them refers to an actual work that is undertaken within the UNFCCC space. I also want to indicate that some elements that are indicated as they are. So it is not a particular position that we are advocating for. This is a slide that is taken straight from the UNFCCC Secretariat. I'm referring indirectly to the loss and damage being featured within that adaptation landscape, where some member states feel that it should be considered separately. But again, this is a slide that is taken straight from the Secretariat. Next slide, please. Yes, so the history of adaptation of UNFCCC dates back to quite early in the process when it comes to COP2, and adaptation and assessment of impact vulnerability indicated within the national communications work. COP7 was an important COP in many ways, personally, because I'm happy to be quite fond of it because it took place in Marrakesh. It was the first of 2 COPs that were hosted in Marrakesh, but also because it was the start of many important work and the creation of many important means of support when it comes to adaptation. Then we move towards strengthening the linkage between knowledge and decision-making through the Nairobi Work Program that made a very important part of the adaptation work within UNFCCC at COP11. Then we focused more on action through the Bali Action Plan. COP16 also, of course, was important through the Cancun Adaptation Framework, National Adaptation Plan, etc. And then on the right side, there's more of an acceleration sense since the COP21 in Paris. I'm not going to go into too many details about that. There's another slide next to one when I will very briefly refer to the adaptation components of the Paris Agreement. COP22, of course, also in Marrakesh, where we work to strengthen the link between the Adaptation Fund and the Paris Agreement. Also strengthen the Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action when it comes to climate pathways linked to resilience, for example. As you can see, a lot of the work from COP21 until COP24 was in strengthening the linkage between the Adaptation Fund and the Paris Agreement as we moved from may to should to shall subject to, and shall subject to shall. And then again, the Chile Madrid Time for Action was also an important outcome. Later on, I will briefly say a few words about the most recent COP until this year's COP, which was, of course, the Glasgow COP26. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. So adaptation under the Paris Agreement is very much present in different, one should not look at any issue, of course, or any article of the Paris Agreement in silo. It is a whole, and there are many interfaces and interactions between the different components of the Paris Agreement. So I would encourage you in particular to look Having said that, the article that is quite known as being the adaptation article in the Paris Agreement is Article 7. But I would encourage you to pay in particular attention to the graphic in the lower left of this slide, as it showcases the different interfaces and interconnections and degrees of intervention between three articles in particular: Article 7 on adaptation, Article 14 with the global stocktake, Article 13 transparency framework, and the levels of action at the global and national stage. Specifically in the context of the current COP, I would like you to pay attention to the global goal on adaptation, where the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program has been ongoing and is doing some important work, building on previous work in the definition of that particular element. Next slide, please. So in terms of the Katowice rulebook, I wanted to bring to your attention two decisions in particular: Decision 9 CMA1 on NDCs and communication, and Decision 13 CMA1 on the adaptation fund. I already referred to the work that have been taken across different, ongoing for across different COPs to strengthen the linkage between the adaptation fund and the Paris Agreement, and there was strong progress in that regard in the context of the rulebook, where we have seen that linkage being strengthened, for example, through the mechanism that was presented to you earlier, specifically when it comes to Article 6.4. Regarding Decision 9 CMA1, NDCs and communication, I know I'm running out of time, but I wanted to bring to your attention one specific element: is the fact that adaptation is country-driven, flexible, and should not pose an additional burden to developing countries. And you can also see indicated in this slide elements of purpose of adaptation communications. Next slide, please. Thank you. I'm seizing the opportunity to indicate that the fact that I'm reading out some provisions is in no way to be interpreted as an indication that the provisions I am not reading are less important. It is simply for illustrative purposes, educational purposes, and given the pressure of time. Now, regarding a few elements, regarding the Glasgow Climate Pact and adaptation, I wanted to bring to your attention two elements. First, Decision 3, and I think somebody is celebrating again the Glasgow Climate Pact, as I'm getting some nice music in the background. I hope it is not too much to the detriment of me being legible and heard by you. So Decision 3, CMA3, linked to Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement, indicates that particularly in the Chapter 7 of the Annex in Article 67, that the share of proceeds to assist developing country parties that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change to meet the cost of adaptation shall be comprised of a series of elements. And I wanted to bring the three of them being equally important, but I wanted to bring in particular attention to the levy of 5%, which is an important outcome that was agreed on consensually in Glasgow. Regarding the Glasgow Climate Pact itself, adaptation was something that was critically important, as is in all COPs, but I wanted to bring to your attention some elements of the Glasgow Climate Pact. First, the importance to integrate adaptation across levels when it comes to local, national, and regional planning. Also, as I was indicating previously, the launch of the comprehensive 2-year Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on the global goal of adaptation. I also wanted to indicate to you Article 15 and 18. 18 also, if you've been following the conversations here in Sharm el-Sheikh, you will have seen that there's a lot of expectations around this commitment that was made, and this urging that was made in Glasgow, which is on Article 18, the fact that developed country parties are urged to at least double their collective provision of climate finance for adaptation to developing country parties from 2019 levels by 2025, with the goal of achieving balance between mitigation and adaptation. As you will hear more about on the climate finance component, climate finance segment of this particular course, it's always been an issue when it comes to the balance between the provision of climate finance when it comes to mitigation and adaptation, with mitigation getting the lion's share of climate finance. And I think this is my last slide. Thank you very much.
We are now inviting Mitra Hafiz Khan, the leading light on loss and damage, to join us. Please, Hafiz, you have the floor.
Thank you. Do you hear me?
We hear you very well.
Hello, Ayman, do you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you really well. Hafiz, go ahead.
Okay, so yeah. Hello, everyone. Last few years, while we organizing this specialized course, when Advocate Ayman ends and I do start with loss and damage. That is when adaptation ends, loss and damage starts. Colleagues and friends, you know, IPCC 6th assessment report clearly recognized that adaptation has limits that include soft limits and hard limits. So there is a limitation for adaptation, and loss and damage has become the reality. If we look at the current situation, the frequency and intensity of the sudden onset events and slow onset processes that are visible all over the world, not only in the developing countries, and these sudden onset events and slow onset processes are causing damage to lives and livelihoods. It's causing damage to infrastructure, and it damage to ecosystems and biodiversity. It is also causing harm to values, culture, and territories. So with this sort of laws, if we would like to categorize, we can categorize in the two forms, that is economic loss and damage and non-economic loss and damage. Colleagues, you know that all of the loss and damage you cannot quantify with economic value, that becomes the non-economic loss and damage, which loss and damage cannot be evaluated with economic values, that is non-economic value. On the other hand, we do see the permanent loss. For example, loss of lives, that's the permanent loss. On the other hand, temporary loss, for example, damage to ecosystems that can be recoverable, and that is temporary damage. So we do see the economic loss and non-economic loss and damages. We do see the temporary loss and damage and permanent loss and damage. To address this sort of loss and damage, we do need technical assistance. We do need financial supports. We do need the capacity building efforts. With that said, if we look at the current state of the global loss and damage regime, let's try to evaluate the evolution of climate change, loss and damage regime in the United Nations framework. Basically, discussion related loss and damage started even before the adoption of United Nations Framework Convention. Vanuatu in 1991 proposed for an insurance pool with compensation approach to address loss and damage. However, United Nations Framework did not consider that approach, and therefore we do see there is no particular article on the loss and damage in United Nations Framework. However, in 2007, at COP23 Bali Action Plan recognized the potential risk of the loss and damage. And the Bali Action Plan also suggested to explore the potential means to address the loss and damage. After Bali Action Plan, Cancun Adaptation Framework that was adopted at COP16 2010. Within the adaptation framework, parties of the United Nations framework adopted a work program for 2 years to explore the potential risk and the means of address the loss and damage that was in adaptation framework in 2010. This work program was really comprehensive. 2 years work program resulted to identify the current and potential risk and some of the ideas how to deal with this loss and damage. Fortunately, and therefore at COP18 in Doha, parties agreed to establish an international mechanism to address the loss and damage. And that international mechanism was subsequently elaborated in COP COP19 2013, that is Warsaw International Mechanism. At COP19 in 2013, the Warsaw International Mechanism was established to address the loss and damage. And basically, the parties identified 3 functions to enhance the understanding and to knowledge, also to promote the collaboration and coordination among the different stakeholders. Third function of the Warsaw International Mechanism was adopted to take action and support. So with that, this Warsaw International Mechanism further evolved with an executive committee. An executive committee, they developed their work initial 2 years work program in 2014 at COP20. They implemented the 2 years work plan, and later they developed the rolling 5 years work plan for the this Warsaw International Mechanism. Now, currently, this year, this executive committee also reviewed their previous 5-year work program and adopted a new work program. So let me focus on the COP21, when the Paris Agreement was adopted. Paris Agreement also got a standalone article on loss and damage, that is Article 8. But there is an exclusion clause. There is an exclusion clause that was adopted in 1 CP21 para 51 that stated that loss and damage does not provide any basis for liability and compensation. COP21 also proposed to establish a task force for the displacement that can deal with the migration and displacement. Then the COP22 in 2016, there was a first review for this Warsaw International Mechanism, but that was premature, and parties agreed to review it comprehensively at COP19. By this time, COP23 in 2017, they agreed.
Hafiz, we need to move a little bit faster because we need to go into the breakout rooms. So perhaps just summarize where we are with the Warsaw International Mechanism.
Thanks, Marcus.
Now.
I will do it. So, at this stage, there is an executive committee. They are implementing their work plan. But in Madrid, COP25, parties also agreed to establish a Santiago network for loss and damage. So we parties are considering that Santiago network can catalyze the technical assistance to address loss and damage, while executive committee is acting as a policy arm of this Warsaw International Mechanism. Here at COP27, the parties are mandated to establish the institutional structure for this Santiago network. And at this moment, all parties are working here at COP27 to adopt the institutional structure. At the same time, at this moment, all parties are involved here at COP27 to develop an funding arrangement to address loss and damage. Next week, particularly, the parties will start the technical work, while at this moment, politically, it is discussing how to develop such innovative financial mechanism. So hopefully this sort of financial mechanism would be adopted at COP29. Next slide. This is basically Article 8 and the rolling work program. Would you please go next slide? This slide, we do see that Article 8 and also some features of the current rolling work plan. There are 5 working streams. At this moment, executive committee is working to implement. Colleagues and friends, at this moment, if we do see the structure of the Warsaw International Mechanism, there is an executive committee, and now the Santiago network, and parties are engaged now to develop the financial facility. This is how the international mechanism is, Warsaw International Mechanism is evolving, and maybe next by COP29, we hope to get parties are trying to structure this mechanism with a holistic approach. I would like to stop here, and I would be happy to respond to any question further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maitre Khan. I'm having trouble changing the slides. We are moving into the breakout rooms. Participants already know what is happening. I will just quickly highlight the 2 questions. List 3 adaptation actions at country level that require a law. Recommend a framework for loss and damage in one country selected by your group. And then for that country, list the country's 3 most urgent challenges on adaptation, loss and damage, and list 2 sectors or existing institutions that should be involved in governing this. We again have 25 minutes for our breakout sessions. We will place these questions into the chat, and the groups will be slightly reconfigured. So you will be with different participants, and please start your session by selecting a rapporteur and a timekeeper, and then allowing everyone to participate. The 2 eminent instructors will go around the breakout rooms, and the entire instructor team will visit the breakout rooms and answer any questions that you might have. So with no further ado, please join the breakout rooms. Thank you for such active discussions in your breakout rooms. It's greatly appreciated that we have so many active participants in this specialization course. I should also highlight that the instructors are already reviewing your brilliant answers for the first mitigation panel that have been coming in. Please keep them coming. Please email us the responses to the second section. And with that, I should hand over to Maitre Chokawi.
Thank you very much. I was able to engage in some of the breakout groups. I thought the conversations were really interesting, covering different elements. One point I made in the case of one breakout group as we're discussing the country to choose and what process and how some experiences will be relevant for others when it comes to adaptation is, while adaptation actions tend to be local, the importance of coordination regionally, transboundary climate risk, as well as the impact of some measures and policies may have on others, linkages to trade, for example, and these other components makes it still very much a global issue. But there are challenges in terms of how to approach from the local to the regional and global when it comes to adaptation. And that's why there's been very important work ongoing on the global goal on adaptation, as I indicated, through the Glasgow Sharm El-Sheikh work program. So congratulations to all the group, and I'm very much looking forward to reading in more detail the contributions of each and every one of them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Marie-Claire, did you want to come in as well?
Wonderful. Just the warmest of thanks to all of you for your engagement and for being ready and willing to participate. I'd like to especially thank our rapporteurs and timekeepers, who I understand have been diligent in doing their duty, both to remind the group when they have time coming up, and then also to type up quickly the bullet points that they need and email them to those who are registering your work. We're looking forward to this final session that is coming up now, and I will let Marcus introduce our 2 lecturers.
Marie-Claire, we are first having a quick lunch break from a little bit more than 20 minutes. So please join us at about quarter to 1 local time here in Sharm El-Sheikh. We will start the session, the teaching session, at 12:50 our time. I hope that's acceptable. And then from that session, we will move straight into the celebrations. I've posted to Oluto, I've posted the questions for the first group into the chat. So if you scroll back through the chat, you will find the questions for the first group. And we look forward to your emailed answers. Thanks again for the participation of everyone. And I've seen some very, very lively discussions. If there are no further questions at this point, I would say we start the break a little bit early. And then if you're coming back into this meeting, so turn off your cameras, turn off your microphones, and then come back into the meeting at about 1:15. We will then start the teaching itself at 10 minutes to the hour. Marie-Claire? That sounds good. Thank you very much. Thank you to our amazing instructors. We should have, the contribution of the World Commission on Environmental Law has already been highlighted. But again, special thank you also from my vantage point in the University of Cambridge to the World Commission for really trailblazing work, and Ayman as the representative here for being such a fantastic instructor. So with that, we will break, and please don't leave. Come back 1:15 and then we will start teaching at 10 to the hour. Thank you.
I would like to underline that, as you know, according to the principles and the pedagogy, we can only certify people who have completed the course and who have been individually assessed to show that they have learned the material. So it's extremely important for you to complete the course. Luckily, there's one session left after the break, and then we'll go straight into the closing. But every year, a few people, we really regret when they have to leave early and then they actually can't be certified. So we look forward to seeing you back here. We're so glad that out of 140 that started with us, so many of you are still with us, and we will look greatly forward to seeing you for the last session right after your break. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. We are moving into our last session, which will be instructed inter alia by Wendy Miles, KC. Wendy is a specialist in international arbitration and dispute resolution with a focus on private and public law with over 25 years of experience. Wendy has advised on international law matters and conducted arbitrations under all the major institutions and ad hoc arbitrations. She has advised a wide range of companies and corporates, sovereign states, and state entities and multilateral institutions. She serves on the ICSID panel, and with regards to climate change and finance, Wendy acts as Global Coordinating Council to various climate change transition disclosure reporting and compliance and investment related issues. She's a real superstar and one of the driving forces behind the Net Zero Lawyers Alliance, and it's a particular pleasure to welcome Wendy to this session. Welcome, Wendy. I know it's very early for you, but if I share the slides now, we can start, and you can hand over to me and Michael at any point, please.
It's perfect. Thank you so much, Marcus. And hello, everybody, and congratulations for choosing to do this course. I hope you find it really, really valuable. This last session, last but absolutely not least, we're going to talk about finance and the learning objectives, just while Tejas is finding those. The learning objectives are, first of all, to learn the key aspects. Hang on. So, yeah, learn the key aspects of climate finance in the Paris Agreement. And that's what I'm going to spend the first five to 7 minutes on. And then Michael, with help from Marcus, is going to come in with transparency. So gain insights into the Paris Agreement transparency provisions and their implications, and gain understanding of the structure, functions, and objectives of the Paris Agreement Compliance Committee. So I just want to start with a little bit, a very quick, brief background. Finance is obviously critically important to achieving the Paris Agreement objectives of climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. But there is, of course, in Article 2.1c, a separate commitment by the 197 state parties to align finance flows with those objectives, and in particular with climate change mitigation. Now, that's all finance flows. That's not just public finance. So that's global finance flows, all public and private. So financial mechanisms are not new to the Paris Agreement. They've been around as long as the UNFCCC 1992. So the contribution of countries to climate change and their capacity to prevent and cope with its consequences does vary enormously. It did in 1992, and arguably even more so does now. So the convention and the Kyoto Protocol both foresaw financial assistance from the parties with the most resources. And under those instruments, under the UNFCCC Article 11, the operation of the financial mechanism was entrusted to international entities, one being the Global Environment Facility. And if you were at the Climate Law and Governance Day on Friday, you would have heard from Peter Lallas, from Jeff, and also the Green Climate Fund. And you would, of course, met Douglas Lees as well, from the legal director from the Green Climate Fund. So those instruments pre-existed the Paris Agreement. And of course, something we hear a lot about in the media and the COP discussions is the $100 billion. That too preceded the Paris Agreement that was announced in Copenhagen as a financial mechanism goal in 2010. Now, the Paris Agreement gives us Article 9. So this is the financial mechanism in the Paris Agreements itself, and it's grandfathered by these earlier provisions. So as I say, not a new instrument in the Paris Agreement, but the concept is the same, the contribution by those who can to those who are less able. So the Article 9.1, developed countries shall provide financial resources to assist developing countries with respect to both mitigation and adaptation. I don't think it's intended to exclude resilience building, in continuation of their existing obligations under the convention. Other parties, so non-developing states, are encouraged to provide or continue to provide such support voluntarily. And then Article 9.3, as part of the global effort, developed countries should continue to take lead in mobilizing climate finance. Remember, 2.1c is all finance aligning with climate mitigation. So take the lead in mobilizing climate finance from a wide variety of sources, instruments, and channels, noting the significant role of public funds through a variety of actions, including supporting country-driven strategies, taking into account the needs and priorities of developing countries. And the mobilization should represent a progression beyond previous efforts. And that is when the 100 billion became a floor as opposed to a goal. So next slide, please. We have just carrying on Article 9, because this is the core provision on financial mechanisms. Scaled up finance should aim to balance between adaptation and mitigation, taking into account those NDCs and the priorities and needs of developing countries, especially those most vulnerable. And see the focus there on public and grant-based resources for adaptation. And part of the thinking behind that is that adaptation is thought to be, although I'm not sure it is necessarily, but thought to be less attractive to private finance. I think structured properly around insurance deals, that's not as limited as it may be thought to be. So Article 5, developed countries biennially communicate indicative quantitative and qualitative information on 1 and 3, including projected levels of public financial resources to be provided to other developing countries. We've seen a lot of pledges come out of this COP, a lot more in Glasgow, one from New Zealand, one from Scotland, notably. So that's those sort of public information. And then the global stock take at Article 14, which we see the first of the 5-year cycles in 2023, will take into account this information as well as that carbon mitigation information. So the finance really matters. Next slide. And just finishing up on Article 9, developed countries shall provide transparent, consistent information on support that's mobilized through those public interventions. This is sovereign funds, as well as development bank funds, as well as those specialist climate institutions, the GEF and the GCF. And then the financial mechanisms shall serve as the financial mechanism of this agreement. The institutions shall include operating entities for that financial mechanism to try to coordinate this funding. So next slide, please. The Article 9 obligation is a bifurcated obligation. The rule book, the Paris rule book, sets out further guidance on Article 9.5 and 9.7, and that was established in 2018 at COP24 Katowice. The distinction between the developed and the developing countries' obligations is interesting, and the language is always deliberate in these instruments, carefully negotiated. Development countries shall communicate the relevant information on their funding. Developing countries should communicate the relevant information basically on their funding needs. I think the market drives developing countries to provide that information. So developing countries are further encouraged to communicate those needs, and climate finance can be in the form of loans, grants, or other financial instruments, and parties are encouraged to report the grant value on a voluntary basis, so that there is a different levels of reporting from the donor and the recipient. Disagreements on the types of instruments count towards the climate finance goals. So all of this again comes into that stock take. Next one. Now, the COP26 in Glasgow last year, there was a note with deep regret. Remember, by the time we got to Glasgow last year, that 100 billion was a floor, but it hadn't been met by 2020. And the cover decision urged parties to meet this target by 2025. It's edging up, but we're still not there. Article 9.4 is the balance between mitigation and adaptation finance. There's a particular struggle to meet adaptation finance goals, partly because it's difficult to crowd in, more difficult to crowd in that private finance, but it shouldn't be impossible. There was an interesting statement made by the presidency on that this year. The decision at COP26 was for continued discussions on long-term climate finance. And then moving on. So this is an interesting update, and these reports are in the UNFCCC documents, so you can keep updating them. Despite it saying new in 2018, this still remains the current assessment of overall climate finance flows. And let me just draw your attention to the fact that those multilateral climate funds, your GEF and your GCF funds, are that little sort of second circle in the middle of that diagram. So quite a small portion of funds. The multilateral development bank climate finance, so that's dedicated climate finance, and other bilateral instruments, that adds some climate focused finance. But the real, then the multilateral development banks, through their blended finance instruments, which just means they will take often the first loss or the front end risk of new development projects in order to create better financial performance indicators for the private finance to meet their own prudential thresholds. So that blended, what we call blended mixed finance, is that outer circle, but the really big contribution on funding really has to come from private. And if you look at that sort of almost, I don't know what it is, but it's about 7/10 of that chart is that crowding in private finance and then sovereign public finance as well. Although a lot of the sovereign investment funds, sovereign wealth funds do require certainly higher returns on capital than grants, but also than a lot of the grant conditions of loan conditions of MDBs. Next slide. Oh, that was it. So we're finished on finance. I hope I didn't run over. It's a huge topic and 5 minutes can't possibly do it justice, but the role is to work on it in the conversation in the breakout rooms. So over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Wendy. And I hand to Michael. He's having some internet issues. So Michael, are you there?
I am here, yes, indeed.
Perfect.
Thank you. So as long as it keeps, and otherwise, Marcus, I'm very grateful that you stand ready to jump in case I disconnect again. So yes, following on a tremendously important topic, as Wendy emphasized, and certainly one of the big topics at the
COP. We're moving straight into another element, which is
and also in the next COPs, including next year, and another, because it's a bit more in the background. Sorry, Marcus?
You go ahead. You were just cutting out a little bit.
Okay, if it happens again, we might just hand over. Is transparency, and it's key also for finance, among other things. It is key for mitigation. It plays an important role for adaptation as well. Technology transfer, capacity building. So really all the pillars of the Paris Agreement depend on transparency. And the Paris Agreement introduces a enhanced transparency framework. So it builds on the transparency provisions of the convention. There were also some in the Kyoto Protocol, but the Paris Agreement really creates a new construct. It's in Article 13 mostly, but there are provisions in other in other articles. Wendy mentioned Article 9 on finance, which in paragraph 5 and paragraph 7 also has transparency related provisions and obligations. And Article 13, one can break it down sort of, it's the idea is that you need reliable, consistent information in order to gauge progress of parties towards the goals of the Paris Agreement, notably tracking their progress under the nationally determined contributions. You also need to have a collective sense of where this progress is going in terms of meeting the Paris Agreement's long-term temperature goals. So the global stocktake in Article 14 is part of this. It relies on transparency. But very importantly, it is not meant to be something where you have sort of the United Nations or the UNFCCC or any other body intrusively looking over the shoulders of any sovereign nation. This is meant to be a very sort of hands-off and respectful process, non-intrusive, non-punitive, and facilitative. So transparency, yes, but really also in a respectful way of the fact that all countries have different circumstances, different capabilities, etc. And just as in finance in Article 9, the enhanced transparency framework also differentiates obligations. Developed countries do have some more shall, so absolutely mandatory obligations, than developing countries, where some parts of the transparency framework are should provisions. They're encouraged to, but they're not necessarily required to report on certain types of information. Now, I'll have to accelerate, but it's important, I think, to get this big picture of the enhanced transparency framework. Let's move to the next slide. Thank you. So this sort of breaks down what I was just describing, that there are certain aspects that all parties have to report, especially regarding their emissions, the national inventory, and then their transparency reports on progress under the NDC. But on some things like finance and other parts of support, meaning technology transfer, capacity building, there's a distinction between what developed and developing countries have to do. All the information reported under the ETF, the Enhanced Transparency Framework, is subject to an expert, a technical expert review. But again, it is a very sort of facilitative, non-intrusive, non-punitive process that is meant more to assist rather than to sanction or point fingers at a specific country for not doing things. All parties then consider jointly where things stand under for instance, Article 9 and the provision of finance. Let's go to the next slide. As with so many other provisions, this enhanced transparency framework required operationalization. Article 13 is one of the longer parts of the Paris Agreement, but still most of the technical detail had to be deferred to a more substantive decision adopted by the parties in Katowice in 2018 as part of the Paris Rulebook. And it is our decision 20 of CMA1 is a very, very long decision, highly technical, with over 100 individual paragraphs with technical details. And parties even last year, still at COP26, were hashing out some of the technicalities in how information on emissions, national emissions, have to be reported, in what format, what timelines, etc. Let's go to the next slide. The global stocktake, as I mentioned earlier, so that's the provision right after the enhanced transparency framework of Article 13 and Article 14, is this collective effort starting next year in 2023 to take stock of how all countries together are proceeding towards progressing towards the goals of the Paris Agreement. Very importantly, in the same spirit as the enhanced transparency framework, it is not about singling out one country for not doing enough, not at all. The Paris Agreement spirit is we're looking at this together and we gauge together where we stand and what we can still do to accelerate the effort. Where do we have gaps? Where can we, especially with support to developing countries, accelerate and make sure that we move towards our collective goals? And this is a 5-year process similar to the NDC cycle, slightly staggered though. In the next slide, we'll look at the final part of what I'm discussing, and that's Article 15 and the compliance mechanism, if you like, namely the committee. So Article 15, and again, you will see the same sort of language about being transparent, but also non-adversarial, non-punitive, not to sort of impose sanctions or penalties, creates this mechanism to help countries, to help parties where there are either violations of obligations or where there's simply also an observable lack of capacity to meet certain obligations, for instance, inventorizing emissions and reporting them as part of the enhanced transparency framework. And a committee was created in order to, if you like, operationalize, to implement Article 15 of the Paris Agreement. Parties can themselves, under the decision that sort of operationalizes this, which was also adopted in Katowice, can themselves ask for the committee to kick in, to become active. So it's really sort of a voluntary self-referral. But there are also certain obligations whose violation automatically initiates the compliance committee becoming active. And then there's also discretionary initiation if the compliance committee observes that there's been significant and persistent inconsistencies in some of the information, specifically on some of the specific obligations under Article 13 of the Enhanced Transparency Framework. If there's persistent inconsistency there, again, the committee can become active at its own discretion. So self-referral, automatic with very serious violations, and then discretionary when there's a significant persistent inconsistency on other things. And let's look on the next slide how this decision that I just mentioned, decision 20 of CMA1, which sort of describes how the committee acts. So this sets out when it will be automatically triggered, the second of the options I just described. And you can see sort of what types of obligations, the violation of which then triggers an automatic initiation of the compliance committee becoming active. And it's things such as transparency, it's reporting on provision of support, Article 9.5, Article 9.7, as Wendy just described. So really some of the key provisions of the Paris Agreement, but also, for instance, not submitting a nationally determined contribution in line with the ambition mechanism that we described earlier. We have, I think, one more slide. It's two, but I think the last one is really sort of very specific. So what can the committee do? Sometimes you will hear, well, you know, the Paris Agreement, it lacks teeth. I think that's underestimating the power of what the committee can do, but it is true. It cannot go in and force a country to sort of, you know, change its ways and really coerce compliance with the Paris Agreement. What it can do is start a dialogue, assist the parties that are subject to a compliance committee process, look at why there's a lack of compliance, why there's inconsistencies, for instance, and recommend what could be done to improve that, to alleviate that with an action plan. And of course, it also issues findings of fact, so it contributes to transparency and understanding of where things stand. And this is not just an individual, this is also really important to how is the Paris Agreement working, or what some of the issues, what some of the obligations, what some of the provisions might be that are not working well and may need revised rules, enhanced, improved rules. The final slide looks at a very specific aspect. The committee can also become active if there is information in Article 6, paragraph 2, cooperative approaches. So what I described in an earlier session, where two parties cooperate to transfer internationally transferred mitigation outcomes from one sovereign party to another sovereign party, and that second party intends to use that transferred ITMO towards compliance with its NDC. And if in their enhanced transparency framework reporting, so in the transparency reports, if there's certain information missing in the technical structured summary, this can then kick in a compliance committee proceeding. But again, this is a very, very specific context. The broader ones that I just mentioned earlier are going to be, of course, much more important. So the failure to submit an NDC, the failure to report what has to be reported under the enhanced transparency framework, etc. With that, I think certainly a bit over 5 minutes, but I think we've covered a lot of ground between Wendy and myself, and we go to the questions. And Marcus, maybe if I can hand back to you, since you've been really the master of ceremonies on the interactive part.
Thank you so much. By now, our esteemed participants know already what we're going to do. I should slowly stop sharing. I will quickly put that question slide into the chat. Is the chat back on?
It is helpful if you put it up as well and just read through it.
Absolutely. So let me read through it. Last session lists 3 important considerations when designing a strategy for the transparent reporting of nationally determined contributions. List 2 financial mechanisms that are available to fund the state's transition to a low carbon and climate resilient economy. Again, could we have exactly 25 minutes? Could the timekeeper give warnings in 15, 5, and 0 minutes? And could the rapporteur please send as quickly as possible the bullet point answers to Nick and Juliet? Are we working with one given country? You can decide. It can be one country for the transparency and another country for the financial mechanisms, or both for the same country. Let us then move straight into the breakout rooms. We're going to mix things up, and luckily our instructors are here and can discuss with you some of the issues that we touched on in the session just right now. So if we can open the breakout rooms right now, and if I can invite all participants to please move into the background rooms. Welcome back, everyone. We're still waiting for some of the people leaving the breakout room. This is the final segment of our specialization course. And it's my particular pleasure to introduce 3 of the people without whom this course would not have been possible. Antonetta Nestor is the coordinator of the Climate Law and Governance Initiative. She's also a postdoctoral researcher at Lucy Cavendish College, and chiefly involved with various University of Cambridge initiatives such as the Center for Climate Repair and Cambridge Zero. And we have Maeve McDermott, the coordinator, also coordinator of the Climate Law and Governance Initiative. Maeve is one of our most successful climate law and governance graduates of previous years, and has been absolutely elementary and essential for the success of Friday and today. She arrived in Sharm and will be available for anyone who participates in the COP next week. And finally, we have Nick Scott. Nick is a fellow member of my college, Hughes Hall, where he serves as the knowledge broker in the Hughes Hall Center for Climate Engagement in the University of Cambridge. And Nick has been helping us with a very stable internet connection from the United Kingdom, where it's much earlier than it is here in Sharm. Welcome to all of you. And so if I could ask you in turn to maybe explain a little bit the contributions that we've received by email from the different breakout rooms.
Sure, thanks, Marcus. So I think we're going to go question by question, and I'll be talking about the first question, which is obviously a fairly general point about some different kind of issues across many different countries, and then one about emissions trading systems. So I think we saw a really wide range of perspectives from so many different countries, which I guess just reflects the diversity in the audience. Some common themes, I think, just in the first place, the need for a legal framework initially to actually implement the Paris Agreement, and obviously the need for kind of as strong of a legal framework as possible. But also a couple of groups noted the kind of need for coherence between different climate policies. For example, one group noted that energy and transportation policies kind of need to be aligned. So as you're electrifying your transportation systems, you need to have the renewable electricity to go with that. And also just coherence between climate policies and other kind of areas of policy like socio-economic issues. In terms of the kind of distinctions, I think there was definitely kind of, people noted the distinction between developing and developed countries, which is obviously the kind of binary that you often see. But I think what was especially interesting that kind of came out of it was the distinctions within these groups. Obviously, we're painting countries with such broad brushes, but, you know, for example, some developing countries, I think one group noted Zambia and its kind of forest cover, which is obviously a really important kind of source of both risks and opportunities for the country. Another group noticed kind of Belize, which has the blue carbon opportunities, and then equally a group noticed Iraq, which probably doesn't have necessarily the same either of these kind of opportunities. And same thing with the kind of highly developed countries. Obviously, we had a group talk about Canada and kind of other highly developed countries with big kind of extractive kind of resource extraction industries, whereas this is obviously a very different situation to, for example, some countries in Europe, which are very services driven. So I think, although that point kind of came out just by looking at the range of different countries, I think, yeah, it was just really interesting to note the kind of, yeah, just how different even countries within these developed and kind of developing buckets are. And yeah, kind of that it's really not that kind of binary. Yeah, just quickly, I mean, another point, just integrity of kind of carbon markets and carbon credits. So, you know, the need that we need these kind of greenhouse gas removal technologies and kind of solutions deployed, but we really can't let that kind of distract us from, you know, emissions reductions, which is still kind of the main mission. And so that some groups talked about kind of, yeah, carbon credit integrity and Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement. And then just on that second question, I think the answers were mostly kind of all, you know, along the right tracks in terms of, you know, how domestic emissions trading systems can contribute to kind of the Paris Agreement's goals. But I think maybe just important to kind of draw out that distinction between compliance emissions trading systems and kind of the voluntary carbon market, which obviously kind of interact. But I think it's always important to kind of draw out that difference. So I think, yeah, on this first question, obviously we saw a really wide range of responses from countless different countries. But I thought it was really interesting, even just kind of reading all of your responses. And yeah.
Thank you so much, Nick. And we should go to some of the highlights from our second section on adaptation and loss and damage. Who's summarizing that?
Summarizing that.
Thank you, Maeve.
Thank you all so much for being here. In the second session, you gained a greater understanding of the legal and policy regimes for adaptation and loss and damage. You learned what the terms of adaptation and resilience refer to. You learned about the adaptation landscape, the history of adaptation in the UNFCCC, adaptation under the Paris Agreement, and elements pertaining to adaptation in the Katowice rulebook. You also heard about how the Glasgow Climate Pact further urges parties to integrate adaptation into local, national, and regional planning. And you further learned about the history of loss and damage in the UNFCCC. In the breakout rooms, you listed 3 adaptation actions at country level that require law. We had some incredible answers. Some that I would like to highlight involve the need to create frameworks for migrants from different parts of countries that have to be relocated due to effects of climate change, as well as people who will need to have career shifts, such as fishermen, different marginalized communities that are being overlooked by policymakers when creating these adaptation plans. One group mentioned the need for adaptation in the agricultural sector, particularly for countries that depend on precipitation patterns and temperatures for their harvesting patterns. And then you further recommended frameworks for loss and damage in countries around the world. So we had some exceptional answers. I would like to highlight that one group did mention that developing countries should have a higher interest in the adaptation issue due to the direct threat that those countries face. And I was just curious if maybe Ayman would like to speak a little bit further on that concept, if he's online.
I think we will sort of take that to the bilateral level in the interest of time. Maeve, very, very rich answers, and thank you to all the breakout groups for participating so actively. And then the final set of answers, which presumably only just came in. Do we already have a sense where the answers are and how participants grappled with the transparency and the financing issues? You're muted.
Yes, so that's me. The answers are just coming through. So the third session, let me just check here the notes. And apologies that they're still incomplete, as I said, that just coming through. And it was on finance, compliance, and transparency. And basically, they were common but differentiated responsibilities. And also they spoke about flexibility, and that better data and information sharing system is needed in order to progress the NDC implementation, and that all stakeholders need to be included to ensure that the reporting is not biased. I think that was something that has been repeated through the different groups. And in relation to the financial mechanisms available to fund the states, basically there were some proposals that a trust fund created from the international community in relation to climate action, but also that more transparency and accountability is needed. And also regional funds, for example, EU or regional unions for like the Commonwealth or OPEC might be useful in developing such funds. And also voluntary markets with compliance market and carbon tax. And yeah, that's sort of like the general sort of summary of the main points that they spoke during the third session.
Thank you so much. Thank you to your fantastic support for the instructors. This concludes the second to last element. I've just conferred with the instructors team, and we're very satisfied that this first part of the specialization course has been successfully completed. We invite all participants to please participate in a multiple choice set of questions, just to give all the instructors the confidence that you've taken away some of the main messages from this course. The slides for the course will be made available to participants in the process. And with this, I hand over to the closing by Professor Marie-Claire Cordonier-Seger, by Dr. Ahmed Khalifa from Ain Shams University. And then we have a special participant in our closing ceremony. Leticia Peron Campos Mayo is legal counsel with the National Bar, Brazilian Bar Association, and one of the leading voices on climate law and the legal profession. Marie-Claire, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Marcus, but also to all of our colleagues who have taught, and to all of our learners who are still with us online and are clearly dedicated to completing this course successfully. So congratulations, you have reached the first main milestone. And I've been able to listen in on a few of the groups. And not only is it giving us good ideas of what you've been able to retain from the slides and presentations, clearly some of the people who were at Climate Law and Governance Day have a bit of an advantage here, but also it's giving us a clear idea of how we can further develop the course, which is really very, very helpful. So thank you to everybody who has been learning online, and also especially our incredibly distinguished colleagues who have kindly agreed to give up their Sunday morning in order to teach online. I would like to now turn to my co-chair and our host, Dr. Khalifa, to say a few words of closing before we move to Leticia and Dr. Omar.
Thank you so much, Marie-Claire. It has been a pleasure to coordinate even slightly with you as Ain Shams University, representing Ain Shams University. It has been a pleasure to help in the organization of this marvelous activity. It's always a pleasure to receive people. We hope that to have everyone physically, but then online also we can say hello. We are in Sharm el-Sheikh, having the pyramid and the Sphinx behind us, so as if you are with us in Egypt. I would like simply to thank the team who has been behind this, Maeve, Nick, Tejas, Marie-Claire, Antoinette, and of course the maestro of this specialization course, Marcus. And I would like also to join Marie-Claire in thanking our friends and colleagues and partners who took off their time on a Sunday to be with us within their very busy schedule, and help all the team to transfer knowledge and to help form or to help new specialists to benefit from their activities. I hope that these efforts were reflected from the participants' perspective. I hope that this mini, short, intensive course was beneficial to them, at least opened their horizons and perspectives to new ideas. And I wish them really the good luck in the second half of the course, because as Marcus said, it's only the first half, which is a group work, but the second half is an individual work. So good luck for everyone. I would like to conclude with a wish, actually. Here I turn to my colleagues in the organization team. I do really wish that in future years, this magnificent course in the substance, in the form, will have more time. I was telling Marie-Claire in the morning that this needs a day. And her answer immediately was, no, this needs 3 days. So hopefully next time we will have more time to more benefit from the top leading experts in the different aspects of climate law and governance, and to help form people. And my second wish, it's a bit more tough, but I promise that I will help as much as I can. I'm dreaming, I don't know how, but I'm dreaming to have, as we opened writing competition in Arabic and one session in Arabic, I hope that we, in a certain way, I don't know why, but I promise that I will do my best to work with the team to have this course also opened in Arabic next year, and next year will be still in an Arab country in Dubai. So hopefully it's a hope, it's a wish, and I promise that I will not save efforts with my colleagues to make this happen if it is possible. Thank you all, and all the best of luck. Thank you,
You do realize, of course, Ahmed, that not only the course in Arabic, but maybe a mooting competition. So with that challenge.
Wow. No. I had this on my list to talk to you and Marcus about, but after the hassle of the events that are one after another, I don't want to take the time of others, but okay, this is our topic for tomorrow, Marie-Claire.
I think so.
Sure.
I think so. This is what the Climate Law and Governance Initiative is all about. And
just a quick
COP
note.
Travels region to region. So
we
have a way of engaging at each time.
Just a quick note in 10 seconds. I am the coordinator and I write the cases for the international humanitarian law competition organized by the Red Cross in the region. And actually in 2 weeks, we have the third regional competition in Oman, in Muscat. And I wrote the case. And one of the two main issues of the case was about polluting the sea by bombarding one of the oil spots, and the discussion as a mooter is definitely on environment, but slightly touching on climate change. But now you're giving me an idea to have a whole moot court on climate law, which is going to be very challenging, but I'm ready.
Excellent. That would be absolutely wonderful, and Dubai is a good place for it, as you say, still in the Arab world. So we have many good ideas that come out of the Climate Law and Governance Initiative events every year, and we follow up, and they do happen, sometimes leading to rather quirky and odd traditions. We are looking forward to seeing your answers in the individual quiz, which will be sent to you by the middle of this afternoon for our time, but perhaps evening for some of you or morning for some of you. And you have until the end of the COP to complete it. So please don't feel you have to rush forward and not have dinner because you're completing the quiz. We're keeping the quiz open to you until the end of the COP. And what we will also really look forward to doing is to connecting you through the registry. So anyone here who has joined us, who has enjoyed the course, anyone who is planning to either study, there's a student category, or practice climate law and governance in their future career, including whether it is through contract law or tax law or environmental law. There are many places where climate change is relevant in the law. Please do log in now to the registry, and we should be able to I look forward to seeing you there if you've decided that this is an interesting area and you'd like to learn more. With that, what I would like to do is turn to Dr. Omar and to Leticia to help us to close this course. Of course, it's an honor and a pleasure to welcome one of the leaders of one of the top bar associations in the world. I'm speaking of the Brazilian Order of the Bar. And I would especially like Leticia to help us to close this course after a very, very successful set of events with the commitments of the International Bar during the COP27 this week. Leticia. She's been coming in and out on the internet. I saw a message saying Leticia's back. But if she isn't yet, I'm going to ask if Dr. Omar would like to say a few words of closing, and then we'll come back to Leticia to give the last point.
Just wrong person.
I think it was actually probably, yeah, there we go. And is he unmuted? There we go. Dr. Omar, would you like to say a few words? Maybe just test the microphone. He's waving to us, but having trouble with the microphone. This is the joy and the challenge of this type of course. You reach people in many, many countries, and in some cases the internet is stable, and in some cases, including here in Sharm el-Sheikh, it absolutely is not. Our worst case scenario is that we record a thank you and a closing address from Leticia and from Dr. Omar, and and we share it with all participants, that everyone who has registered online over the next few days. Dr. Omar, do you want to try one more time to say hello? And if it works. I'm not sure he can hear us. Does someone want to send him a message? And is Leticia or her colleague?
Dr. Omar,
Lara
are you
online?
now online? No.
No.
Marie-Claire, we're having technical difficulties. So please, maybe you and Ahmed could just do the closing.
All right, will do. And worst case scenario, we will certainly send his address to everyone at the end of the course, along with an address by Leticia. So with that, I would like to thank everyone for participating in the course today. We kept it shorter than we normally do, partly because of the internet and other challenges that people face, and also because we understand, of course, that an online course, unlike a full day course that is held in person, has to, by its pedagogy, to be accessible, to be short enough that people can do other things that they have to do from their homes on a Sunday. So we would like to thank everyone who has participated. I would like to especially thank the team, Antoinette, Nick, Maeve, Tejas, for their patient and incredibly helpful support. I would like to also, of course, thank Ahmed and Marcus, and certainly not least, our incredibly expert and distinguished instructors who have assisted us all the way through here. You are being taught by people who has helped the parties to draft the Paris Agreement. They are literally the best people in the world to be able to explain in a neutral and independent way what was decided there and what was intended there. So I'm glad that you were able to have this opportunity in the context of the COP27 here in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And I look forward to seeing you again online over the course of the coming weeks and months as we try to ramp up efforts, scale up efforts with everything that we can to implement the Paris Agreement before it's too late. Thank you.